Hello and welcome back to Climbing on Mount Sophia. In this adventure, I am joined by my trusted friend and climbing partner, Steve. From what began as a casual catch-up conversation, we journey toward the notions of grace, faith, and how they relate to an idea known as gratitude. These have been prescient questions for both of us, and as always, the attention to the tension of a question yields fruitful. As always, thoughts and engagement are greatly appreciated. With ayahuasca, I'm definitely interested. I'm also sensitive to, I've seen a couple of things about, becoming just this like touristy thing that people
Yeah.
who are kind of in it for the, the like, well, I just want to do a weird thing. And I'm like, they're like, something that I take very seriously is the notion of a pilgrim versus a tourist.
Yeah.
And that's a really important distinction of posture to me when I am exploring new space. There's the version of standing over here and looking over there, and especially taking a picture through a camera, right?
Yeah.
Something very like that is so deeply symbolic to me of that, that sin of locking something in.
Trading the experience for the capture. Yeah, it's brutal.
Yeah. So there's that posture contrasted to a pilgrimage, which not only is about the sacredness of the place that you ultimately come to, but it's also about the stops on the way, if you will, of coming into proper relationship with whatever thing is at the end of this journey, whether it's some kind of relic or whatever, whatever is real about things embedded in relics and those kinds of things. Like I certainly I certainly can make arguments for how that might be valid, but even if you don't believe that, just the kind of way that changes the way you think about reality, just to go through that kind of posture towards the world, I think is really, really powerful. So anyway, all that to say, when I would be very interested in doing an ayahuasca journey in the Amazon or something like that, but I would want it to be
legit,
with people and with someone, some shaman, and also just I would like to be furthering the journey of the pilgrim rather than the tourist when I do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for me as well. I wouldn't be going to have a drug experience in that sense at all. It would be, can I shake this space-time system in any other way I haven't shaken it before, so I can see a new frame. Like it's really a frame prospecting trip, because I've learned a lot from changing frames with psychedelics, and specifically noticing the difference and what can be brought back. Like for me, I couldn't care less. It's funny, it's all about being in the moment for sure, but at the same time, I'm not driven towards peak experiences like that for the moment. The hedonistic element of the moment. For me, it's more about the fundamental changing to your own foundation. That's
yeah, it's not the pleasure, it's the insight.
Yeah, it's the permanence of the moment and how it will permanently change you.
Yeah, and I think the notion that's so important there, and I don't know if we've talked about this or you've heard this, but
I'm trying to record, and it keeps making me ask you for permission.
Oh, I'm not getting anything. Did you request?
Yeah, but maybe because I already did, it doesn't come up now.
Oh, here we go. I can just give it to you whether you request it or not. There you go.
All right.
Ask, you shall receive. Well, so I'm not sure if you maybe have heard someone talk about this, or we've talked about it, but the notion of the imagination versus the imaginal. And I almost like fantasy more than imaginal, just because
Mm.
different people will use imagination very differently than I'm about to. And so that can be really confusing, I think. So maybe fantasy versus imaginal. And the thing that's the same is they're built on like the same structure of your cognition, which
Mhm.
is, hold on, my dogs.
Oh,
It's been raining today, so they haven't been out much, and so they get kind of
yeah.
evenings
Yeah.
play.
See.
So they run on like the same layer of the cognition, which is the layer where you can take things that you patterns that you know about or that you've experienced in the world, and you can just abstract them out of whatever thing they were in and put it together with something else. It can be
Mhm.
from whatever layer of reality, can be really transcendent ideas that are smashed onto, rock structures or something, and you can just look at them. But the point is, that's what you do. And you can do that for two different reasons. You can do it in order to escape from reality because you just don't like your life,
Mhm.
which is really, I think, technically, it's something like a lack of gratitude. Because I think gratitude is
More.
actually a fundamental force. I've been thinking about gratitude and gratefulness a lot. And I think it's
Mm.
one of the fundamental forces, or maybe like one of the fundamental postures of the human being. Anyway, um, but fantasy is you're using that machinery to escape from your life. You're building a fantasy world that it's me imagining that I am the professional baseball player I wanted to be as a child, right? And
Yeah.
I can still live that dream because I dreamed it a lot as a child. But for me now, all that does is make me resentful of my life, of what it is now,
Mhm.
in some way, even if it's really trivial. Versus contrasted to the imaginal, which is using that same system, that same machinery, to look at things that actually have some kind of relationship. And by looking at them, you're able to see through these patterns that can afford you greater insight into reality in your own life. So it's looking at the person. This is part of why you should always have someone that you look up to in all kinds of different areas of your life, because
Mm.
you look at that person, you watch them, and then you try to imagine yourself as if you were, seeing the world the way they do when they do that brilliant thing or whatever. And it's deeply affording of real connection to reality.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like you're in one case you're pretending you're already there without doing any of the work. So it's just all destination, no journey. And then in the other case, you're using that ideal, that other version of yourself or the attributes of your heroes and building yourself towards them. Um, quite literally building your pathways from where you are to where they are and becoming that. Um,
Yeah.
there's a little phrase I have. I put it on a piece of exercise equipment that I got because it was meaningful to me, but it comes in handy here where it's basically become to overcome.
Mm.
So basically change your identity first to become what you want to be in that sense. And it's kind of interesting because of how much we talk about being, but there is also that aspect of becoming that it's a razor thin edge of doing it the right way, of course, because as soon as you say that, it sounds like maybe traditional self-help and all these things. But um,
Well,
there is a very real sense in which we are here and we are a thing that is iterated on. So,
if you can't, like, self transcendence is core.
yes.
It's like one of the
Yeah.
fundamental things you have to have. And like, I love what John says about this in relationship to Hegel and Hegel's work, because I'm re-listening to the Meaning Crisis. I actually listened to this episode today where
Mm,
he talks about Hegel. It's brilliant. Um, it's so brilliant. Listening to them again
mm,
is knowing John the way I do now and being able
yeah.
to kind of, like, John has become somewhat transparent to me in a real way,
That's interesting.
in the sense, and I mean that in the sense that, did you watch that conversation I had with Chris?
Yes, I did. I didn't manage to get thoughts to you, but I did find it very interesting.
Okay, yeah, maybe we can talk some about it here. But
Sure.
in that sense that Socrates becomes transparent to those who like are trying to love the good. Like
Mm.
if they look at him, they can see the good through him. I think John's. I'm not. I don't want to deify John. I don't worship John or anything like that. But his work has allowed me to see things that I couldn't otherwise. So now when I'm watching the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, I pick up on things that are so much deeper than before.
Yeah.
But anyway, gosh, sorry.
Hmm.
Hegel, in his conversation about Hegel, he talks about, he says how, Kierkegaard's critique of Hegel was that he built a system and sat down beside it,
Mm.
that it
Yeah.
was finished, right? And this is the problem with the perfect theoretical system. Is ta-da,
Yeah. I'm done now. Okay.
and now you're hungry,
Yeah.
right? And so
Mhm.
and that's exactly the point, is like you can't leave self-transcendence behind.
Yeah. It's amazing how much of society seems to actively avoid it. Like when you look at what self-help is, a lot of it, in the more traditional sense, is really an avoidance. Like it's a way to maximize your attention on yourself, like really as if that's the biggest thing that's missing, is that you aren't already excruciatingly reviewing yourself and how you should be. And if you're buying a self-help book, you probably are in that category.
Mm.
But there's a nature in which, like, there's a more profound sense of self-help where you are accessing the transcendental to modify yourself, but yourself still exists, right? And so when you're in that space of trying to align to agape, there are concrete steps and certain parts of you or patterns within you that still need to be undertaken.
Yeah.
It's not like you can conceive of agape and then get there every time. There's real difficulty in pulling that off, and I mean, that's where the rubber really hits the road in terms of putting the theories into practice. And honestly, for me, like the more like my I think our mental model is getting very clear these days, at least to me. And so I have two parts of me: one that's pushing, okay, let's get every other piece of the model we can and tie it on. And then the other side of me is like, no, we need to really start putting this in practice, because we don't want to sit beside it. I don't want to, like, it would be the almost worst outcome for me if I would like go off and try and do ayahuasca or something like that to further the model. You know what I mean? Like, important as it is to me and so interesting as it is, that can't be the goal, because I could encounter an experience that's counter to some of my other models that I built. But also it's the desire to actually increase the brightness of my own consciousness.
Mhm.
The content, the clarity with which I look, super important, but it's ultimately about increasing that brightness and being that light for people around me more. And I think I'm driven towards like the social side of things much more so these days.
Yeah. No, that's I think that's a really beautiful way of talking about it. And I think the right way of talking about it. I was having a conversation today with someone who he said something like he had used to enjoy philosophy, but because he now does medicine, he can't do philosophy anymore. And
Mm,
I said, I understand what you mean, because you're talking about what philosophy means in the modern day tyranny of propositions. But
yeah.
if you realize that phileo sophia means like the attempt to get into a cooperative relationship of love, in terms of like, so I think of phileo as being, and sorry, I'm going way off topic here, but this is cool.
Sure.
So
Mm-hmm.
um,
Go where you want.
like if perfect phileo comes out of perfectly shared agape, bidirectional shared agape between two beings, coupled with true fully humble arrows toward the highest good. What comes out of that kind of phileo with
Mm,
the what being hyper object, um whatever you want to say, that is Sophia,
mm,
the hyper symbol, like that's not something that you just do academically, because
yes.
inherent in that is a manner of being in your real life right now, no matter what you're doing, that that to avoid it fully defeats the purpose of the thing in itself.
Yes.
Like, to make a model and sit down beside it,
Yeah.
it's in some sense almost the worst thing you can do.
Yeah. And this is, I think, tangential to some of the conversations we've had about academics and how, the goal of being perceived as an intellectual in itself can actually be quite counter to the goal of engaging true phila, I believe you said.
Yeah.
And it's a challenge because you kind of want to build a reputation of some sort, start having influence in society. So I understand some of the pressures and motivations in some of these spaces, but ultimately at the end of the day, if your goal to do anything other than be a good person, be in alignment with agape, really any goal, even being a smart person or a wise person, whatever it is, can actually get in the way of that ultimately. So I think I've become as interested as I am in the intellectual side, and always will be, really part of who I am. But I think that making sure it connects to the heart and connects to people is, and I think it's more important for humanity ultimately too. I think that the objective and the intellectual side is very valuable for institutions to rework
Mhm.
them, and I think that needs to be done. But on a personal level, like, I think it will be by example
Mhm.
that the change takes place. I think there are people in the world that have never known love.
Mm.
Um, you know, very likely the majority, and that might be an understatement.
Mhm.
Um, and a book
Yeah.
isn't going to fix that, isn't going to help that,
Yeah.
let alone the fact that the book has a barrier as well for just being
Yeah.
through words.
Yeah.
So I think, like, how I actually get myself into instead of just intellectual conversations coming the most alive, like as
Mhm.
soon as I wake up, or my kids are screaming, and it's just a chaos situation, still being able to hold that space.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's where a lot of my head's been at, really. Yeah.
Yeah. So what does that look like? How's that unfolded for you?
Um, well, I haven't been doing an excellent job at it lately. I think I've been, like, wanting to be there more than being there. But I certainly do have moments where it's there. And I mean, we just had our third child, and during the experience of the birth, that was a very easy thing to participate fully in, because it's, an amazing, magical experience. So I could tell, like, even my wife, like, the way that she saw me when I was looking at her, what in that moment was as who I want to be and who I want to be seen
Mhm.
as, in that healthier
Mhm.
way, right? Whereas I'm often not able to be there because of work, or, I mean, really just because of my own distraction,
Mhm.
myself distracting me, which is a funny way to say it. But
Yep.
yeah, basically, I don't think I'm at that good place very much, and so that's why it's coming up.
Mhm.
I feel like I've mapped out the territory well enough to be
Mhm.
there more often, and at the same time, I get into a flow when I do creative work and when I have conversations like these, but I want to transfer that to the realness of life. And another way of saying this is, like, I think my upper chakras are pretty well developed and my lower ones
Mhm.
are falling behind. So I just want to
Sure.
recognize
Sure.
that balance.
What kinds of things, so two parts of the same question, I guess, that are coming up for me are, what kinds of things do you find are, like, when you look at it, what kinds of things hold you back? And conversely, what kinds of things pull carry you back to the flow?
Mm. But it's definitely a possibility that carries me upwards, like creation, being creative, or thinking of my place within creation and the whole of the universe. Like the bigger picture, the more the easier it is for me to access from that higher plane kind of thing. And on the lower plane, that's where it's harder for me. But I
Mm,
think it definitely has to do with gratitude. So I'd love to talk about that, because I think I mentioned before, like what I tend to fight through to the truth is resentment. And
mm,
that comes from the pains that I've had, but also just like, you know, wishing things were different ultimately, with humanity, society, my own body. Because I've been in a place where I've had a lot of traditional success, but it doesn't really register because of the pain. So it basically kind of feels like, oh, things would be great if not for this thing. But even engaging in that equation is what brings me down, because it's a lack of gratitude, which is a resentment towards God, right?
mm, mm.
Resistance of nature.
So when you find yourself in a situation, because it sounds like it's not even that you're finding yourself in situations in terms of circumstances that are not what you want them to be, except for some pain. But you said like you've had a lot of traditional success, but
Mm.
but there's something of just wishing that something was different, even something totally external to you. You look out at the world and you wish that was different. And it's the very wishing of that to be different. Is it that, or
Yeah.
is it, or is it the process after that?
Well, I think it's kind of both. It's definitely just wishing things were different,
Okay.
but that maps into my existing other things I wish were different. So it's kind of like a contagious, like I see something in the world I don't like, then I start feeling the pain in my body, because that is what that's the most intense feeling of what I wish wasn't, you know.
Oh,
So
interesting.
I'm kind of
Okay.
being like pulled into my body pain a lot by what I see. And
Hmm.
we talked about having different identities at different levels, and that level of humanity and what it thinks of itself, that's part of the burden that's on my shoulders. That might be very metaphorically true, but there's
Sure.
some aspect to that where my physical health and my views of society are in entangled in a complex way. And
Sure.
that's the situation I want to get out of. Whenever I get myself into
Mm.
that, like being underneath that and being like, I have to fix that because it's so bad, that just kind of snowballs into a need to escape, or a need to inability to lift the burden, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. So
But
there's
gratitude, in a sense, is almost recognizing it's already being lifted for you, which is,
so
go ahead.
yes, before we go there, we go there in a little bit, but I want to, because this is really interesting. So there's a way in which you're, I'm trying to get this right. It's like if you're in the flow, you don't have a sense of anything needing to be different than it is for you. And
Mm.
then what pulls you out of it is this sense of, oh, something should be different about reality. But then almost maybe almost immediately kind of a primary manifestation of that is a return to this sense of feeling of pain in your body.
Yeah.
And then that is also somehow related for you to the societal trauma, something, or just issues
Mhm.
you grapple with towards maybe society in general or just other people.
Yeah, and think it's because pain is, in the mind, is so fundamental. Like suffering and agape, like, are two sides of the same coin, effectively, right? Sin. So I think that's
Wow, that's
been one of my challenges, is that when I look into the world, I see it through a layer of pain, regardless of what's happening. I'm looking at my, beautiful baby girls, and I feel like shit.
mm,
So it shouldn't be that way. So there's beautiful things happening, wonderful stories playing out, and I'm happy with all of it. But there's this pre-filter of suffering, that, pain that I'm engaging in, that's still distorting that. And so that's part of what set me on this journey, because it's realization that the things out there aren't actually mapping one to one with the things in here, but it's the ease with which that filter clicks on for me, is still a source of frustration at times.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I hear that. I hear that. I want to, but maybe I didn't ask the question the way I wanted to.
Mm.
I mean, that was totally legitimate direction you took it, but I'm I'm trying, there's something about a connection between there's something about the connection between feeling the pain in your body and how that relates to your sense um of needing to bring change to societal consciousness, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I think one of the realizations is that we have transcendental functions, that wrap this up quickly. But basically, I think we have identities at different levels because of that. And so whether this is all dealing with the unconscious generally, but we can still discuss it. But I
Yeah.
think part of what a human is the sum total relationship of all of humanity, and their view of that, how they think humans view each other, and how they view that is one of your identities, right? That's one of the levels that's at play there.
Okay. So
Um,
some kind of almost like deep collective sense of being okay with each other. Is that kind of, and then maybe how I
that
individually
would be a
relate to
very
that.
healthy one.
What's that?
That would be a very healthy one. I think in general, with the internet and things like that, one of the worst things about it is it's really reduced humanity's perspective of each other and themselves.
Yes.
So basically, how significant and important I feel
We
is
hate
related to
it.
how
We hate
significant and
ourselves
important I
more than
think
we ever have.
humanity is.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Yes, yeah. As a species as well as individuals. That's my point.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And because that's one of the identities, and it's low, what's it's in the unconscious, so it's not talked about much. But prior to that is the agapic sin lens. So any layer, that's part of the contents, right? So any layer before it can get that filter put on it, and there's always a connection between the subject and the object plane. You can have a distorted connection. That's what I think I have, but yeah.
Oh man. I see what you're saying. And I see where you are very clearly. And I also see where I'm wanting to, the way I'm wanting to articulate it, but I don't see a bridge in between very well. Because I think this is a real, what's that?
I'm saying just jump to where you are, and we'll try and find it.
Well, so I guess what's coming up for me is this, like, because I think each of us is a microcosm of all of reality. I mean, because technically that's what your brain is, because in some sense you're at least as far as you can make an argument from kind of a philosophical standpoint, or a scientific standpoint anyway, you're finitely subject to the limits of this body, this brain, and its computation and cognitive abilities, regardless of what those are. And therefore, that is the sum total of everything that you know. Now, obviously, there's much more than the sum total of everything that you know out in the universe, but everything that you contain within your brain is all you will ever know of that universe, and everything else doesn't exist for you at all. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Yes.
That doesn't mean it doesn't exist collectively, but it doesn't exist for you at all, and it never will. So, because you don't know what you don't know. And so there's a manner in which we can use like the things we see in society are the things we see in ourselves in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And so where I'm going with this is the notion of forgiveness, because to some degree, my ability to forgive my brother in that sense, regardless of where he's at, regardless of how much evil he's done, you might say. Um, and to do so by means of agape would be to actually resolve the tension that I feel internally. Whether it impacts him or not is up to him, maybe. But
Mm-hmm.
at least to the degree that I understand the cosmos, that aspect of it will be at peace.
Mm-hmm.
Because every time I look at it, I can see the injustice, I can see the evil, I can see the sin. And this actually, like, I think we all do this, thank God, because if we didn't, we would all kill each other. It would have a long time ago. We all do this inherently. We do it in minor ways, and it's much harder for us when they're more significant. But we will frequently overlook and love someone despite the fact they're not who they could be.
Mm-hmm.
Even someone very far from us, just because it gives us more peace.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean we have to approve of their activity, but we can just allow them their own being. And so by means of doing that, we actually can resolve the space within us where we hold this kind of collective identity like you're talking about.
Yes, yeah, I
And
totally agree with that.
that doesn't necessarily mean that the macrocosmic aspect of all those tensions are somehow resolved, but your interaction with those people in real life, say I forgive someone totally, even if they don't, and their life doesn't actually get fixed, to the degree that I interact with them now, they will feel agape from me. That's what they will feel.
And the tremendous healing power of that as well.
Yeah, that doesn't mean they can't resist it still. Of course they can, but I can't, like, if someone's been truly forgiven, there's like, you almost can't relate with them anything but agape in some sense. All right, sorry, I'll stop there. But
No, so I think that's all of that is right. And just to jump to like where it really gets to a practical example is, this is like, maybe this is definitely biblical on some level, but how do you forgive God for the world we're in? That's ultimately the challenge people face when they're looking at religious or spiritual things, is like, yeah, the two things that come up is like, how do you justify evil? And then also, how could an all-powerful God create a not all perfect world, right? But on a very sophisticated level too, it is, if you're talking about total surrender, total acceptance, it is actually complete forgiveness for everything that's ever happened. And it's so weird that you can have this understanding that we are a fragment and we are the whole, and there's still so much tension between that fragment and whole on some level, because I suppose the fragments are not, they're able to not be representatives of the whole in some sense, right? And so that's where the tension comes from.
yeah, I mean, that's the story, right? um
Mm-hmm.
and there's a sense in, I mean, what I see when you're saying that is like, that's another part of the macrocosm microcosm thing of forgiving God, because in reality,
Mm-hmm.
that's all you're doing the whole time, is forgiving God for the ways you've decided he's fucked it up. That's what it means to repent from sins, because what sin
Mm-hmm.
is, in some sense, is the, the declaration of, you know, the reality as created by the fragment as being the right one.
Yes.
That's what it means to know good and evil, because in some sense, when you're talking about even that initial move of wishing the world was other than it is, I mean, that's the essence of pride already. There is
You're
because
becoming you're you're attempting to become the whole as the fragment, right? That is
exactly.
the becoming God in the wrong sense, to apply judgment as opposed to participation. Yeah.
Yes, this is why it's the idolatry of the self, right? If you hearken back to Chris and I's conversation about the idol versus the symbol, and he talked about the symbol is a part presencing the whole, and a idol is a part mistaking itself for the whole. And so fundamentally, the move of original sin, which practically may be something like just wishing something is other than it is. Like
Yeah.
actually in a moment, wishing anything was other than it is right now. And always has been and always will be. Like doing that, that's the thing. Like you mistake, and that I like that insight that I had during that conversation with Chris, that the ultimate symbol is to be human, because in some sense that's all that we actually ever know and are and can be is human. So the ultimate pattern that we know is human. It's the biggest one.
Mhm.
It's the biggest pattern you can possibly find because you're working from it. You can't find the edges of it. Like it's but it's the pattern that you're in. And so to the degree that at least you allow it to be what it could be, then you can actually see through. And then you finally actually become the symbol. You finally become the fragment presencing the whole instead of the idol that you've always been creating yourself to be.
Mhm. It's and so in what sense, why is that space so much easier to access from a peak place like this kind of conversation versus when confronted with the mundane? Because in a certain sense, I feel like in my life I've always found a lot of what other people struggle with quite easy, and
Mhm.
what I struggle with, other people tend to find very easy. So yeah, the mundane and the maintenance, that kind of stuff is what is the hardest for me, because I guess it doesn't feel significant. It is, but it doesn't feel like it in the same. There's kind of like a desire for grandness at play there in
Yes,
some sense.
yes, yes, very much. Yeah, yeah, and this comes, I don't know. One of the first things I see with this is just there's so many layers of bullshit,
Yeah.
right? Because and using the technical use of bullshit as being the are you familiar with the distinction between lies and bullshit? And that lies are,
Ricky. Yep.
yeah, intentionally misdirection, but it knows what the truth
Yeah.
is. And bullshit is just complete shifting of relevance to something that's totally
It's just
irrelevant,
noise
whatever.
generation. Yeah.
And and technically, I mean, everything between you and that is bullshit.
Mhm.
It's these layers of what entanglement, trauma,
Yep.
uh, bad ideas, just all the shit, and however we're all connected to each other, right? Um,
Hmm.
from from the beginning of time to I don't know, trivial things in your day-to-day life that you've judged and held on to. Like there's so many subtle ways that those have tweaked us, to where now we believe all we are is just an arbitrary speck of will inside some massive, meaningless, collision of particles. And that's kind of what most people believe. And it's like, wow, that's a terrible little prison. Um, so yeah, it's so much bullshit. So maybe the right question is what gets you through bullshit?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I've really admired about many of your conversations that you've been having, where you're able to cut through. So Let's see if I can say this in a nice way. I think I've really enjoyed some conversations. It's not nice. I mean, it's nice about you.
No,
Um,
that's fine. That's
I'm
fine.
just
That's
trying to
just,
say it in the
yeah,
optimal way.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, I get it.
Uh, I feel like you've been dealing with some very interesting conversations because they're flipping between a lot of honesty and a lot of eloquence, and those aren't the same thing. And you've done a very good job navigating back towards honesty,
Mm,
where eloquence can is specifically what smart and articulate people do to generate bullshit.
yes.
Um,
Yes.
some people are fine just throwing any noise, but smart people need to throw, people who think of themselves that way need to throw, pretty flowers because that's more distracting.
Yeah.
Um, so I just wanted to say that because
Mm,
admired that a lot of your conversations because it basically doesn't seem to matter how much eloquence they put out. You've managed to redirect that, and that is a real skill and a challenge.
mm,
Um, because yeah, I mean, some of the people you're talking to are extremely eloquent,
mm,
but that is a facade that just as any other is, right? Like,
mm,
I think in society we have these tendencies to give credences to certain escapes.
mm,
Oh, he played the good escape card, so we won't mention it. But
mm,
when you bake it down, they're ultimately playing the same game as the shell master in terms of moving around. Like, yeah, okay, but let's look at this one instead. You can
mm,
do that, and if, in fact, the smarter you get, the more of a trap it is to create more elaborate swirls
mm.
and swoons through things that other people can't follow, and that's the whole idea, I think, of being ineligible, legible.
Mm, mhm,
People can't understand you.
mhm.
That's the whole thing in academia, just to seem smart, right? That's the
Yeah.
extreme end of it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's kind of you. Yeah, it's a funny thing because like on one hand, I there's something like maybe maybe you would be open to a differentiation in term there just like because oh I'm not sure what the term I want to use instead is. But there's I wish because I certainly recognize the connection of eloquence to sophistry, you might say.
Yes.
And I
Yeah.
and I know that's what you're saying. Like that's what you're saying. Um,
Mhm.
but maybe but eloquence to me, I don't like. I This is just a quibble about a word because I
Sure.
want, I think eloquence is a virtue, and I
Mm.
don't want to tarnish that virtue. Um, because I think elegance or eloquence is close to elegance. Actually,
Yeah.
that was a nice wordplay. And
Mhm.
elegance is simple,
Mhm.
and so there's something.
Undisguised,
Yeah,
you might say. Yeah.
there's something about maybe the highest
Yeah.
level of eloquence in includes in it. And this is a little bit. This brings
Mhm.
up one of the things I was talking about with Chris of like this idea of being able to see through or jump on Schindler's back, as I said, right,
Mhm.
and ride with him. And I think that's what you're saying too. Is like, can you get that musicality of the language such that, and maybe that's what cuts through bullshit, right?
Mhm.
And we're talking about cutting through bullshit. Certainly, you can do that without the finesse of the language, but maybe the finest, cleanest way to do it would be the most eloquent of language because it would be the most precise and beautiful way to frame into words whatever thing it is that the person needs to see, but to be done in such a manner that they can actually see it. So it's funny because
Mhm.
it's so close to sophistry,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. Yeah.
It's like sophistry and like the production of bullshit and eloquence and the
Mhm.
call to the good. Like, man, they're almost two sides
Yes.
of the same coin almost.
I can totally see that because you might interpret eloquence as the union of truth and beauty, right?
Mm,
And so, in that sense, it's the truth expressed in a way that is going to have the least resistance and the most upward agapic impact on your who you're talking to. And I think that that's a beautiful thing to go for. But it's funny because the overlap of what you add to truth when you do that is what is sophistry, right? So you put that on, but it's to ease the transition into that truth space rather than to take away from it. Because I've listened to a lot of people that have kind of no charisma. It's just like wet socks, kind of just total, really hard to listen to, but
Yeah.
powerful truths. And that is just not the same experience as listening to someone who can, kind of spin the web a little more.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's why you need a narrative, because the bullet point of facts is not going to get people up out of bed and pursuing the topic space. So
Sure. Yeah. So that being said, I want to go back to what you said, because I appreciate that very deeply, because I think that maybe in some sense is core to the project of what it means to climb on Mount Sophia. Because in like, this whole channel thing, this whole doing of this thing, has become quite a symbolic enterprise for me in every sense of the word. It started as just kind of like a somewhat offhanded, vague metaphor, and it's become something so much more tangible and real now for me. And I take that very seriously, because it's not like I had any image that I was trying to make it into. I actually, when I developed it, it was actually just a vague offhand metaphor from a book that I really liked, and a couple of words that seemed, it just seemed like it fit a little bit. I was like, oh, this is whatever, creative, something strange. But but on the way, and it's not during the conversations, it's like after the conversations usually. I go back and I watch them, or I think about it more, and just the journey that I've been on. It's become such this symbol for me. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be just for me, but in order for it to be a symbol that others might be able to connect with, and I mean that in the fully symbolic, like the full use of the word symbol, then I'm just gonna, my role in some sense then is to be just a person to try to see what it means to climb on Mount Sophia. And in some sense, key to that enterprise seems to be this notion of cutting through bullshit. So I have not thought about this before you said that, but I think I appreciate that a lot, because you're also not saying that about people who, like, I'm talking to, who are full of bullshit. People that I'm talking to on the channel are very much not full of bullshit.
Yes. Yeah.
And so to say that I'm redirecting them back towards the thing in itself, I take very seriously, because I don't, I know you're not someone who just kind of throws things around like that. So so I take that very seriously. I guess my question is, what do you, from your perspective, what do you think it is that, like, what's the nature of what's making that happen? Because I'm not trying to do that in any sense. Like, I'm not like setting out to do that.
I could look at it from many different angles. I think you display a willingness to be vulnerable and open. Like a lot of people who don't do it well will try and present perfectly, or try and present in some way that, oh, that thing you mentioned, oh yeah, there's like, okay, maybe there's one pixel at a place, but that's, there is never an invitation to more being wrong potentially. Whereas I think you tend to acknowledge things in a way that it's like, yeah, this is one issue of probably many, and it's just they're using this body language because you open yourself to attack effectively, displaying to the other person that is what the conversation, how it should be expected to go. It's kind of, there's always that frame in between two people of how they ought to be interacting.
Mm,
So you invite them in a warm way to a space that people generally do the opposite of and
mm,
close off. And so I've seen people realize who they're dealing with and have to recalibrate
mm,
their responses in real time to you. And that is where I'm noticing that, right? It's just like, oh no, like we're playing the full game here. That
mm.
how I would summarize it.
Oh,
We're not playing the pretend game.
oh, wow. Thank you.
And it's another way of saying just like the portal is open enough that the person realizes if like they'll fall through
Mm,
in the good way, and they should want to do that.
mm,
Whereas I think in a lot of other cases, there's kind of a guard at the door. It's like you're showing, like, people are showing you a mirror, but not really, versus having it all the way open and being like, come on, step in.
mm,
Let's explore what I should adjust real
mm.
time right now.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, thank you. So it has to do, sorry, I'm a little bit overwhelmed by that. So thank you. Um, so it has to do with, moving down through layers of identities that we're willing to show each other.
Hmm.
Something like that. It's like
Yes.
there's layers of identity that we bring to social situations, you might say.
You could think of them as pieces of armor, and you drop them at the door in certain conversations.
Sure, sure. And in some sense, there's probably a whole combination of things that makes you more or less willing to let go of those. But deep in it, well, maybe in some sense, fundamentally, is how it comes down to how safe you feel in the situation. And so
Hmm.
now there's elements of, say, people who've never really felt safe in any situation that it might be quite difficult for them
Yeah.
to ever get there. Um,
Hmm.
but one major component of that is how willing the other person is to take off their armor as well.
Yes.
And so if you're someone who's maybe not held to your layers of armor, regardless of what situation you're in, if you're willing to lay down your armor at all, and someone takes off their armor, then you're much more likely to do so.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Was it you who told me that the parable that was really powerful in the sense where there's like a warlord going around killing people? Stop me if you told me this, but it's a really compelling story I heard recently. A warlord's going around killing people. He's every city he goes into, he goes to the holy man and kills them, and then moves on to the next one. And so he's taking out all the spiritual leaders, kind of thing. And then he gets to this one town, and the normally everyone's fled, and he has to kind of gather them from the countryside. But this leader is just sitting there in the middle of the temple or whatever, and he says, why did you not run? Don't you know who I am? I could kill you and not blink an eye. And then the monk responds, don't you know who I am? You could kill me and I won't blink an eye. And then so the general lets him go because he realizes like he's not at that level.
Mm,
Just in terms of that, like, you go ahead, take a stab because it's not going to affect me.
yeah,
And I know what I am on that level.
yeah, yeah. I mean, which is like the in some sense the core of the Christian ideal, which is that in the end resurrection wins, because in the end it actually is more powerful to die than to kill, and that
Mm,
that that you know and this is why, like Chris said in our conversation, the Christian idea is such a thwarting one because you
mm,
can't get underneath it. You can't beat surrender because the worst you can do is kill it, and then it
mm-hmm.
wins. Like, you
Yeah.
you cannot beat it. And You say, well, oh, yes, but you beat it, that loses on all the, say, biological evolutionary fronts, that loses. You're right. The reason that it wins for humans is because the part of us that's running the show for that's doing all this stuff is the part that needs to die, and that's not the part that is evolution.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that's running the show, the thing that is, the aspect of yourself that is unwilling to die is actively the part that's resisting evolution. Right? It's actively
Yes.
the part that is resisting the machinery that your evolution has given you. Because if you believe in evolution, and if you're a hardcore believer in evolution, you have to acknowledge that evolution has given you your cognition and your relevance realization. And if you give me cognition and relevance realization, I will show you how your unwillingness to die is actually the exact same thing that is disconnecting you from reality and from spirituality.
Yeah. That I think that really gets into the core of it, that willingness to die in any moment. If I think it's like a Saw movie game where like there's a sword in the middle and you and your friend or you or whoever are in a room and it's like, one person survives, you have to kill the other person kind of scenario. And fighting, not fighting, your human instincts are going to be to grab that sword and do what it takes to survive. But the spiritual instinct is to no, it's more important to not play the game this way. The outcome isn't ultimately what's important. That's I think one of the hardest things to grasp is that there is no outcome, there is no destination that is the ultimate
Yep.
goal at all. Like even in your own life,
Yep.
it is the way of playing that's important.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And this goes back to one of the original comments you were making about the necessity of the theoretical becoming existential. Is that, this is why John is so right when he says, on my tombstone, put neither nostalgia nor utopia. Because nostalgia and utopia are abstract concepts that serve a purpose in narrative, but they are fundamentally unhelpful when it comes to real life, because none of us know a beginning or an end except for our individual beginning and end. And that individual beginning and end is finite. And it's not in charge. It's not in charge of the big game. And so however you might think the world's going to end and whatever you might think utopia is going to be, for you to work towards that version of it is to commit a massive, not just hubris, it's fully irrational, because you can't possibly know what the best outcome would be. You can't possibly know what the best world would look like, because you don't even know the variables undergirding it. And so, that any movement, right? Any move towards this is the theoretical ideal. It if it doesn't feed back onto your real life and make it more real, right? If it doesn't help you when you're washing the dishes, if it doesn't help you when your car breaks down and you're late for work, then it's not the thing. It's bullshit. Even if it's Hegel, even if it's Hegel, right? Hegel's fantastic and it's deeply helpful. But not if he's not layered really well with Kierkegaard, and understood to with this. And I should note, in case I do post this video and people are watching, we're not glorifying physical death here. We're not saying that you need to kill yourself or die or anything like that. What we're saying is like no, like what does it say? What's the line in the Bible? Um, it's not coming to me right now, but it's the same thing as it's the same idea as when God tells Adam and Eve that they'll surely die once they eat of the fruit, and then of course they're not physically killed. It's because the real death, the real death is the disconnection from reality. Because what it means to be human is to be connected to the real reality on every level. And physical death is like physical death is in some ways bound up with being disconnected from reality, but it's far downstream of the kind of death that we're talking about
here. And projecting into the future, that finish, that end to one's life, has a tendency to distort your evaluation in the moment, as if that's the purpose, right? Getting there and doing so in a good way, or maybe ending higher up the mountain than someone else or something like that.
Yes.
That is all, even on the level of humanity. So this is getting like back a little bit to what we were talking about. Like on the individual level, that's not mysterious to me. That's something we've talked about a lot. But the outcome for humanity is the same deal, right? The human species could be wiped out tomorrow by a nuke from Russia, Ukraine, whatever, some other thing going on. And we have to be equally okay with that as 100 years from now, us having mastered every, being all over the cosmos. So there's things that are very exciting to me as a person that I would love to see. One of the versions of heaven I had in my mind earlier, not so much anymore, but was just when I died, I just wanted to watch how the human story played out. I just want to see what happens with the rest of humanity. That I'm very curious to know how it goes. On some level, that is what I've done, and I can say it explicitly, still the case, but I've taken my individual identity and let go a lot of that, and then attached what is normally there for many people at this level of humanity, what happens to humans. And that is, obviously I've tried that in the sense of looking out for humans and being a good person in my own version of that. But ultimately, it's the same thing, same pattern playing on a different level, where it's not my own death I'm fearing, it's humanity's death, in the sense that we're headed towards it, right? And how can we not do anything about that? How like I'm looking around at the world this day that it's in now and being like, no one realizes like we're gonna die, like if we continue down this path. So
no, I think that's that feels like the right place to go from where we've been in this conversation, because that's really right, and oftentimes becomes the case for people as they begin to let go of parts of themselves. This is something I've experienced a lot as well, is that you begin to surrender your personal life. You begin to actually get surrender in parts of your life. I'm not talking about trivial, like just praying, oh God, it's okay if my dog dies. It's like, no, like you really look at it, like you look your dog in the eyes and you think about how much you love them, and you feel what it would feel like for them to die. Like go into that imaginal space. And then when you're there with it, you're like, I'd be okay. And not out of a sense of like, armoring yourself against it. You're actually like, hey, I surrender this. This is not mine. I can't make that happen. And you do that all the way up. You do that with your own life, right? That's part of that conversation I had with Chris too, where we were talking about presencing people's death to them. And he said, you can't really do that in some way unless you've done it yourself. And I think that's a really good insight, because it is, in some sense, to do it with yourself is to do it with someone else. And so, but then like after you've surrendered a lot of those pieces of, the things that we all typically hold on to, you get to these higher levels. And there's a lot of there's a lot of trauma to work through there, man. Like it is hard
Mhm.
to forgive Hitler,
Yeah.
right? I mean, don't even make it Hitler. Obviously, that like people can't hardly even look at that.
Yeah.
No one can look at that. I mean, you talk about somebody, I don't know, who's somebody relatively trivial that everyone hates. Trump, if you don't like Trump, or I don't know, Biden, if you don't like Trump, like, or you do like Trump, like pick whoever it is that you really hate, who's maybe not quite Hitler, and really think about what it would mean to forgive them. Really think about what it would mean to radically let go of all the ways in which you judge them.
And forgive all of them,
Yeah.
right? Because it's not just one person, it's everyone, everything that happened to you. Like just let all of it go.
Yeah. 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 Because in some sense, it did happen to you, right? Like there were probably monstrous people who did horrible things before we had recorded history. Monstrous,
Oh, no doubt.
right?
Yeah.
And none of us hate them because we don't know about them.
Yeah.
They might exist on some level of our unconscious. I don't know how all that works, but you can't really forgive them.
Mhm.
To the degree that you've interacted with them, this is a way in which people are immortal, right? It's like, you know, Socrates has been dead for 2,000 years.
Hmm.
The way I've experienced Socrates over the last 2 months, in large part by means of insight of DC Schindler, and obviously also John, like he's very much alive.
Mhm.
Like you can feel Socrates when you really get into that kind of space. And so anyway, all that to say, it's easy for your identity to get stuck at those levels. Sorry, I got into that one a little bit, but
Alright, so-
it's easy for you to get into those levels. I feel that I'm in there often. And obviously you can't forgive those people for those things from your own ground because they didn't even do it to you.
Mhm.
You know, like that's one of the things. Like you can't. There's nothing I can do to forgive Hitler, right? Hitler, aside from just his crimes against humanity, he didn't hurt me personally. Um, so in order to, so there's nothing of me that can forgive Hitler, but I don't think there's anything of me that can forgive me, right? So let's just start there. I can't even forgive myself. God knows that's still like probably the hardest thing for me to do.
Well, I mean, that's the funny thing is that this all boils down through all the levels into that ultimately anyway. Like it- on some level, the bullshit is the switching between these levels. This is what our mind's designed to do, but it ultimately that is yourself. Like the way you see the world
Mm,
and all the people in it, that is a construction that is built at the same time as your own perspective. Like
mhm,
you build what you are and what the world is at the same time
mhm,
and in relation to each other because you want to be what this is not, and you want to you want this to be what you are. That's the tension I'm talking about, really.
mhm,
So it's necessarily a subject object plane tension that's taking place
mm,
there. What's interesting though is that you have to, while we can call it bullshit and trivialize it, because of the complexity of what the mind is, you do actually have to sort through it a little bit. Like it's not like you can have a transcendental experience and then just know the way through it at all moments in time, because you are physically caught in the context of the moment
yeah,
and unspinning it, unraveling it into formlessness
yeah,
each time, every moment. And that's where, have you seen that meme where it's like on one side you have like the whirlwind of nihilism that's just like crushing despair, there's everything's pointless, and the other side the excruciatingly meaningfulness of every moment with the dragon kind of thing. That that realizing the importance of every moment and actually what's on the table for you if you buy into yourself versus are able to keep that frameless space is crazy. It actually makes every single second critical.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I don't, I I don't pretend to experience that really. I have this sense of where hmm, how do I say this? What allows me maybe to even think about or talk about things in this manner is it has to do with a sense of surrendering to the things that I know that are above me because I haven't seen them yet. And what I mean by that is that,
Mm.
like, I find myself in places doing things that don't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
Um, it's not because I know where I've been, right? I know the things I've thought about. I know the person that I am. I mean,
Mm.
no, but like I know what my story has been. And I know how I felt about myself and how I looked at the world at all these different points in my life. And I look at, say, the person I was in college or the person I was a year ago. And I look at the person that I am now, and I'm not quite sure. I'm like I couldn't chart a course from there to here by
Mm.
any means. Like it wasn't like I was shooting for a star. It was like I just, I had no conceptualization that stars were there.
In an interesting way, I bet there's parts of your life that have worked out better than you had the imagination to conjure at
Oh,
that
a hundred
earlier
percent,
point in
a
time.
hundred
Like,
by
yeah.
far, by far. And so, what I mean
Yeah.
to say by that is not some self-congratulatory. My life is cool. It's a statement of humility in the sense that everything that I am, everything that my life consists of now, was not earned or deserved by me because of my ability to see it and make it happen at earlier points in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me,
It's not a predictive, yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
And so I like, to me, that speaks to something like higher order patterns in my own life or something that were operating beyond my conscious knowledge, right? That doesn't mean that there were some like
Mm.
weird beings like up here. It was just like there was more to me than I knew. I just didn't know it was there. And it was taking me somewhere that it could see that I couldn't see. My consciousness couldn't see it at all. And and so now the biggest thing for me is to, when I'm caught in the bullshit, which I inevitably am all the time, like, is to trust, is to trust these, just this, whatever this life is, because, well, it's gotten me here. And, that's probably something much easier for me because my life has been, um, say, less traumatic than a lot of people's has. But um, regardless, it's what I have. So um,
Mm.
yeah. So
And
maybe that's key in the.
that's the fascinating thing.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say you used a key term there, which is it's gotten you here. And, here is a very different place based on where you are in here. Because, as you said, if you have these traumas, it's not what was done that actually hurts you the most. It's how it keeps you there
Mm,
and not here. Right. So
mm,
that's that
mhm.
entanglement across time where you've basically built some kind of blinder on your third eye. Your agapic portal can't open all the way or has some tension to doing that because of the perceived resistance on the other side. And here, in a very profound way, I think you'll grasp how I mean it. Like here is here, but you can be here without being here, and then you're not here at all, and you'll always resent that because what you want to be is here, like fully here with everything as everything through here.
Mm-hmm. So this feels
Because
oh
like when you internalize it, that's when the problems come.
yeah.
Anyway, go ahead. What were you
Yeah.
saying?
Well, I was just gonna say, and I don't know how much time I have left until my wife gets back, just so you know. But this feels like a good time to bring in this notion of gratitude,
Yeah.
because I think what we've been talking about in this whole conversation has been circling around the notion of
Mhm.
gratitude the whole time. So maybe I'll ask you to make a proposal about what gratitude is,
Okay.
and I'll reflect some things, some back to you, what I hear from you.
Well, I think I personally, in the past, and now I'm using gratitude more broadly, but in the past, I've separated the concepts of gratitude being towards another and maybe something like rejoicing, which is towards your own life. But I think the way you were trying to talk about gratitude, I believe, was more of that rejoicing, more of that just to be here, thankfulness
Mm.
for awareness,
Mm.
thankfulness for the opportunity of experience. That isn't a horizontal gratitude, it's a vertical
Okay.
gratitude that
So,
enables us to put that burden down. Go ahead.
but I just want to stop you every now and then so I can like stick with you and restate it to make sure I know what you're saying. Um, so for you, it had been a sense of like there had to be an object of the gratitude,
It's
external.
like a debt more
Mhm,
so, which
mhm,
there's a lot of
mhm,
problems with that view.
mm.
Yeah.
But now you're feeling more of a sense of it. Maybe is it that still, or is it more a sense of gratefulness beyond the other person?
Yeah. So it's definitely that still in a certain sense, but it's mostly beyond because what that was one self being thankful to another self. And then this other space we're talking about is a being, is consciousness being grateful for all things in itself.
Mm,
So it is a vertical versus a horizontal use of the word.
okay.
And I mean the conversations we've been having lately have been together, how that vertical comes down and becomes that horizontal.
Mm-hmm,
Uh, but
mm-hmm.
I think ultimately it is that resentment of God layer that people struggle on. I
Yeah.
think the self to self part is the more trivial side of things.
Mm, mm. In some sense, though, the microcosm issue. But
Yeah,
so is gratefulness or gratitude, what is it? Is it a feeling? Uh is it a choice? Is it an act of the will? What is it?
I believe that it's the nature of the relationship between the subject and the object plane.
Hmm.
So there's me and there's the world,
Hmm.
and gratitude has to do with the tension and the overall structure that they both create together. So it's the wholeness, and whether that wholeness is feeding to you and others, or feeding off of you and others. It's a momentum within the whole structure of the subject object.
So it's like it's in some sense this it's the nature of the connection.
It's the flow of the subject into the object and the object into the subject, in
Hmm.
a sense,
So
connected to faith, as we talked about.
is it something like one of the fundamental maybe modes of describing what the relationship between the subject and object are or is?
Yes, it is definitely a transcendental function. It's not something that the self does, it's something that's done to the self
Mm-hmm.
and changes the self. If the self is a construction, then we're talking about something that is, the hologram. Something about the way that the hologram is constructed is changing that locusing point that generates our frame in
Mm-hmm.
and itself, and the criteria with which we view everything
Mm-hmm.
is flowing differently. It's more open to change. That it's almost like a softening of our mental structure in order to, I mean, there's an uplifting sense in which it's good for you to do it
Yeah.
versus the terror of, fear that can be
Yeah.
similar, but in the total opposite direction.
So there's this way in which it's like it's the thing beyond us that
Yeah.
calls or moves us into the proper relationship.
Mm.
So I'm wondering about what how this notion of it being this transcendental kind of like force that's moving us, right? This kind of thing
Mm.
that's beyond us, right? That's beyond the self, as you said. So
Yeah.
if that's the case, where like what's the relationship to what, if I go to someone on the street and I say, what does gratitude mean to you, or who do you feel gratitude towards, or what do you feel gratitude towards? And they say, my mom, she brought me into the world, right? So assuming that that's not an illegitimate use of the word, maybe just
Mm.
say a lower form than what you're saying, what would be the connecting, how would you connect those two?
Yeah, I think that's the I think the gratitude we have towards each other is in a sense the pull the pull towards each other, you might say, is love more so, but gratitude is almost a pull towards ourselves we have because of someone else on that level.
Oh, interesting.
So they are horizontally showing, like, pulling you towards your true self through who you currently are based on what they showed you. They're showing you a pattern on some level that you are not just you. That's what they're
Mm,
showing you. Uh, and different degrees of integrating that. But when someone does something you're grateful for, you realize they're acting, or at least the outcomes of their actions have been for you as well as them. And that's a reminder that you aren't
mm,
just a self, you are this larger
mm,
entity.
so there's a way in which um mm, so gratitude, in some sense, real gratitude,
Mm.
like we're assuming that even in your gratitude, like, I'm not straw manning this. I'm
Yeah.
picturing someone who's like maybe even a hardened criminal that you're asking this question to, who's like not someone with a great deal of resentment and not much gratitude. But assuming that this gratitude is real, then in some
Mm.
sense it is a acknowledgement of the way in which that person has made themselves transparent to the good, you might say. uh,
Mm-hmm.
the way in which that person has manifested or shown forth the goodness of being, say the goodness of God, or you could say God himself, depending on like what language you want to use. I think those are all kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
um, and so that to oh my, oh my, oh my, okay, so in some sense, gratitude, true gratitude, is because okay, so when someone's showing you God, they're showing you agape, and
Mm.
agape is received as grace. So if it is the case that you being grateful to another person for something with real gratitude, I hope I'm not equivocating gratefulness and gratitude here, but I mean gratitude all the way through, if that's not right.
Mm.
But to show gratitude is to actually receive that agape, which the receipt of agape is grace. And so gratitude is the link by which you can receive grace. And it is through grace that faith can be powered. And it is faith which is the proleptic motor that can take you beyond that which you already know into deeper contact with reality. Whether that means resolving tensions in your own life or others around you, or whether it means, in some kind of theoretical space, or whether it means just creativity in nature and creating beauty, or whether it means just like, say, I don't know, beholding the face of God, whatever contemplation, I guess would be the right word then. Okay, so that seems like a decent proposal of what gratitude might be.
Yeah, you threw out a ton of extra terms there, which I know we mentioned a little bit in text, but
sorry, yeah, this is like this whole like cosmic chain of ontology that I've been playing with, but also existential. I'm trying to do that, but sorry, I got carried away there. But
no, I followed you. I just wanted to touch on a couple of the points there because faith, the description of faith there, one more thing to say about it, I think, because I don't think that grace gives you faith in my using of the words.
Okay.
I think that you need faith to get grace more so. Because I guess I'm using faith as what the self has, the powerless one in a certain sense, has towards the all-powerful, in giving itself up in recognition. And it is faith that grace will be there to receive it in doing that. But I think that's kind of the kernel of the problem, is that the challenge of it is that there is pain, there is suffering, and you're not sure the grace will be there. And it will be, but if it's done the right way. But that's the faith. The faith is what moves you towards the place where you can put the totality of your pain into the furnace and have it healed through grace. Like for me, grace and pain are grace is the healing of pain. I don't know, just wanted to throw that at you and see if that resonated with what you were saying or felt different.
No, this resonates very much, because this is why I asked the question on Twitter, because as a short digression, I think I've learned maybe or seen, I don't know that I've learned it, because I'm sure I will often not use it in this way, but I think I've seen what maybe the proper use of Twitter is, which is to, find a community of people you believe to be at least somewhat wise, at least as best you can tell, and then ask good questions. And then trace down the lines of intelligibility that those people can provide you. Not for any purpose of like convincing anyone of anything, but just trying to see better.
Yes.
And so that's why I asked this question, because this is where I started. Where I started with this was this, like, looking at my life and looking at the ways in which I'm not what I could be, and the ways in which I cause myself harm and others harm, not in any deep sense, but in any trivial sense, just the ways I'm not in what I could be. And so I'm looking at it and trying to genuinely figure out, like, how do I do these things? What do I do here? Because I can try all these self-discipline methods, but I've done that my whole life, and some of them are marginally successful, but they're not like, like, it depends on what it is, and maybe it depends on your personality. Maybe I just don't have as strong of a will as some people. I don't know, but I was thinking about it and going around in circles, and I've read all these, I've done all this stuff, and I'm like, why is it that I'm still running into these ways in which why I'm being foolish. Why am I still doing this? Even though I know, like, I know the theory, I can actually even talk about how to engage the theory in my life, but I continually forget in the moments that it matters to engage the theory.
Mhm.
Um, Even though, I also try, I'm not just theorizing and talking about it, I'm also engaged in practices anywhere that I can find them that actually seem to afford these self-transcendence, if you might say. So anyway, all that led me to was this notion of faith. All these things kept pointing me in this notion of faith.
Mhm.
Because even discipline is a form of faith, right? Disciplining yourself to go to the
Yeah.
gym every day, uh,
Mhm.
which has been one of the easier things for me to do. It is a faith that has provided me that discipline. It's the faith that it matters. It's the faith that I will, proleptically become what I could be in the sense of, my bodily fitness. So even on that level, it's faith. And so then the question just becomes, well, how do you get more faith?
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
and I've been wrestling with this because I'm like, is it something that I can generate? Because that's, this act of the will kind of thing. I mean, I'm very suspicious of act of the will kind of, power of the will
Mhm.
philosophy, because that, it seems to me there's all kinds of problems with that, because it holds on to, in some sense, it holds on to some almost like concrete self that's imposing itself onto the world. And it's like, where am I standing from that I'm using my will exactly? Like, yes, I do seem to have a will. I'm not saying I don't have a will, but like, if that's the bottom, I don't know what that's standing on. Um,
Yes.
because I mean, if it's just material reality, well, then you're stuck in this strange thing where, like, well, where did your material reality come from? Like, this is just a Gnostic nightmare if that's the case, because like talk about being the victim of some evil overlord. If I'm just an arbitrary will stuck in this massive, machine that's way more powerful than I am, like, God, this is horrible. So that's not a better, like, that's not better. It's not going to afford you self-transcendence. The
Mhm.
whole thing breaks down. So anyway, doesn't seem to be an act of the will. So the question then becomes, like, where does faith come from? Because you're right, like, the best answer I can come up with is the one I gave about grace. And it seems like gratitude is here, and this receipt of agape, because that is so much more of a hopeful and also more real ontology with agape at the bottom. Um,
Mhm.
but I don't know, because I think because there's a way in which I've been running into, and I don't know the answer, because, and I think you pointed out the exact tension that I felt is
Mhm.
faith is in some way fundamental to the way in which I move, whatever the I is. And so is it
Mhm.
possible, you might say, is it possible, if indeed gratitude is the way by which I might accept grace, shall we say, then, well, how do I become more grateful then, right? How do I cultivate gratitude? Well, that seems to be an act of faith. So again, like, so it's
Mhm.
almost like wherever I turn, faith is behind me. So I don't have a great answer for this, but I'm very curious about it. Basically, I just took your argument and was like, here's a ton of, like, force behind why this is important, and I don't know.
Yeah, no, totally fair. This is the crux of entering that agapic space, right? Um,
At least that's the claim from the top of the food chain in Christian theology, which
yeah,
gives us
and many
which
other
gives us this
Christians as
agapic.
well.
Exactly, which gives us
Yeah.
this agapic framework anyway.
Mhm.
So
And there is, there are ways that I feel like I have cultivated faith. And I could say that because I'm from a very faithless place, just um, not just not being part of a tradition, but yeah, just being very judgmental is part of not having faith in a certain sense, right? It's like feeling like things are prescribed. This is how things are going to go. There's no faith to it. It's just fact-based kind of more mindset like that, right?
yeah,
Um, so I think there has to be some recognition of the inadequacy inadequacy of the self, which is there. It's always there, but like the healthy version of it where you admit that it's beyond you.
Mhm.
And that doesn't mean giving up, but it does mean looking for another way in which things can be done, that way outside of the self. And I think, I think that, using the left hemisphere and building an ontology and a model has helped me gain faith in certain ways because
Mhm.
I can refer to the map, I can remind myself, I can retell that part of my brain what it is, what's going on. And so I have spent a lot of time developing that
Yeah,
because I use its own pathways to get it out of itself.
exactly.
Uh, I think that's
You
part of
make
it.
it the emissary, not the master.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I see Ian McGilchrist reference. Yeah. Um, but I think that that is ultimately not going to get you all the way. Like it's a reasonable thing to do. It's a good thing to do to help teach people and explore the space. But I think ultimately there is a presencing nature to faith. So there's metta, which is a tradition of just loving kindness, and you know you can basically summon emotions temporarily, right?
Mm.
The most profound emotions, you can just sit down and decide to have them, and you can get good at doing that. So you can actually generate your experience in that sense.
Mm.
Now, some people struggle with feeling like that's real,
Hmm.
but whether it's real or not is also decided by you in a sense,
Hmm.
right? So
Hmm.
you can summon these feelings, um, but faith is a little different than doing that, um, because I don't think faith, the way that I think of faith, it's not like,
We even, in some sense, already engaged faith even to do that.
yeah, because that already
Yeah.
has a destination at
Yeah.
play, whereas
Yeah.
faith is more like, I don't know where to put my next foot, you know,
Yeah.
you know. So it's definitely a transcendental function. The closest I can come to expressing it is kind of like an opening. Is a motion that comes to me that
Yeah.
is faith more than a word.
Yeah.
It's a stance of the
Yeah.
mind,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Posture and orientation.
Yeah.
And it's deeply, I mean, one of the things that I'm hearing you say, or a note that I'm hearing throughout what you're saying is humility.
Hmm.
And that's a notion that's come up often in this exploration
Yeah.
that I've been doing of it. And it does seem to be inextricably tied. It's certainly inextricably tied to gratitude.
Yes.
Um, because inherent in gratitude is the recognition of the undeservedness. Uh,
Mm. It's funny because I've said before, like if we were to actually feel as much gratitude as we should, as we ought to, you'd just be paralyzed. You'd be paralyzed by gratitude. You wouldn't be able to do anything
yeah,
because absolutely everything, like any object in a room, millions of people involved in creating it, iterating it to the point where you can enjoy it just as it is, and
yeah,
words alone that's happened on every
yeah.
part of our enmeshment and engagement with reality is actually based on and coming from others.
Not to
And
mention every one of your ancestors, which goes
yeah,
back billions of years.
yeah. And so in a real sense, it shouldn't be hard to summon the justification for gratefulness because there's no part of you that isn't part of the greater cosmos. And yet at the same time, it's the hardest thing to summon,
Mhm.
a lot of the time. And it's what is the opposite of gratefulness or gratitude? That might be a way of coming at it as well.
I mean, it's like there's a lot of notes where we're talking about the other side of the coin of pride here.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot, like it might be that when we're talking about gratitude, we're also actually talking about humility. Um,
Shame.
yeah,
Yeah.
pride and shame on the other side I think the opposite because it's fundamentally every like you can't really talk about pride in a deep sense without thinking about the sense of deservedness.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, which is the opposite of what we're saying here.
I described pride as shame on the prowl. That's my favorite description of
Oh,
pride that I've heard,
interesting.
because you're actually, acting out what you're not, and that's part of the relationship as well. Like your own ego is pretty much what you feel you aren't.
Wait, hold on. Okay. Shame on the prowl as pride. I am fascinated by this, but I don't understand it. And I know you just described it, but I got stuck on that. I didn't even hear what you said because I was just like,
So I think our ego isn't constructed randomly, right? Like it is basically the opposite of what we feel we are.
okay,
It's our defense mechanism that stands up and tries to occupy the space that we feel we need to occupy
okay,
to for life to go well.
okay.
But because of that, it's inherently the opposite of what we are.
Mm,
Not in a complete sense, but in a sense of the self-viewing itself, right?
yeah,
So
okay, sure.
so the pridefulness is really feeling shame and rejecting it to the point of like trying to grasp and hold that space as your own.
Okay, okay. But in some ways, aren't we like, isn't shame downstream of pride? Because you have to do the pride thing before you even build a separate self. Like pride is the first move of building a separate self and an ego, right?
Well, I'm
I'm not,
suggesting that
I like
pride
the,
and
go ahead, sorry.
I'm just suggesting that pride and shame are um, different momentums or directions on the same spectrum,
I see, okay, okay.
and so they're happening at the same time to create the self.
I see. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like a description of the functional way in which pride moves, not a description of what pride is in itself.
Yes.
I see. Okay, okay. I'm with you there. That's where I
This is
was like,
why, yeah, you can get a lot of people who have their kind of act shameful or ashamed, but they themselves have a internal righteousness
yeah,
over
yeah,
how they're not prideful, and so you just get on all these kind of, and the reverse is obviously the classic
yeah,
ego case.
yeah, yep, yep,
Yeah.
yeah. And pride, like shame, is a direct downstream of pride.
Yes.
It has to be. It's almost maybe the fundamental primary one, and you see that in the Garden of Eden story, because the first thing they do is realize that they're naked and they're ashamed of it.
Yes.
Um,
And so I want to give you a little bit more ammunition to run there, because in a certain sense, I think what we're saying is pride is the inflation of the self, and shame is the deflation of the self.
sure,
And
sure.
connecting that to gratitude, because gratitude is an inflation of the non-self, the frameless, and pride is the shrinking of that space to expand the self. So like if the self and non-self have a relationship like the subject and object plane, where they create each other in size based on their relative presencing in the moment.
So it's like pride is an incursion into that which you are not, and then shame is the recursion down below that which you are, in the sense of internally, foisting my will onto, the reality that I know in my mind. Pride is the inflation outward to take on that which should not be mine. And
Yes.
shame is the re you know what's the word I'm like the equal and opposite reaction to shrink away from myself downward.
Yes.
And so they become this,
To
in some
not
sense.
take up the space that you should. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you might say the fundamental sin and death, like that's the notion of sin and death, isn't it? Like sin creates death, and if sin is pride and death is shame, like those are pretty close.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And the interesting thing about gratitude, gratitude in some ways is like gratitude is like the antidote to everything.
Yeah.
Um,
It's so if we have that vertical picture of pride and shame, right?
yeah,
Gratitude seems to be a lateral movement where you're taking perhaps pride and shame in the right balance. You're taking it to its correct space. So
it's a
you know,
deflation of both sides at once.
yes,
Yeah.
it's a um, displacement of
Mm.
of that whole self energy into non-self energy.
Hmm.
So you're not playing the pride shame game, which is what that's what the self is doing. There's all the layers are on top of that layer. That's the base layer.
Mm-hmm.
And we can take that and pull that out so that goodness isn't about us. Pride and shame, goodness is us and how we're doing, how big we are, how small we are. Gratitude is goodness doesn't operate there. That's not the place for it. Goodness
Oh,
operates
oh,
here.
good. Yes, good.
You're switching instruments. It's actually relocating your presence from the judger and evaluator of yourself to proper judgment and evaluation, which is gratitude.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Another way to say it is the resolution of karma,
Mm-hmm.
the agape to tension, because
Yes.
that's the nature of what happens to that level in which there is disintegration. Is that so? It's almost as if gratitude is like the orientation function to foster agape in your life,
Mm-hmm.
because it may like because I do think like there is this way in which that actually allows in grace, and
Yes.
all the ways in which faith is operating, faith and grace are really tightly coupled together. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe maybe you just get intrinsic faith. Maybe it's literally like, maybe faith is something like the life force that if you don't have any faith, you just die. I mean, in some sense, that's true. Giving up the commission of suicide is, I think you could make quite a good case, is actually the loss of any faith in the goodness of being. Um, it's the abject loss of faith. You cannot live without faith. And so maybe that's something like that's just what you're given. That's just what you have. And the question is, how much do you burn up? Like, you get fuel, you get a certain amount of fuel in your tank when you start, maybe, or just depending on how much you cut yourself off. Maybe it's something like that.
I'm going a slightly different direction, but it's related. So I was really resonating with what you were saying about the tension.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm imagining actually in this case that awareness is energy. It is the application of energy to
Mhm.
anything that you could look at.
Okay.
So if you're looking at something that looks like a pride shame spectrum, when you look at it, you are applying energy to that. And the tension, the pain of that is what we want to get rid of usually. Like that's the ego,
Yeah.
all the haunting we do of ourselves
Sure.
through ourselves. And then gratitude is almost like it redirects the energy coming from awareness, not onto this instrument, but onto another one,
Mm.
where this instrument can actually take the full power of your awareness and
Mm.
yourself can't.
Mm-hmm.
So by actually applying awareness to yourself in that sense, you're overloading a system that can't handle. Your awareness is bigger than yourself, and you're putting more than that system can handle, and that's what causes it to, not do well. But if you're in the space of gratitude, of root awareness, just being, there's a limitless space of energy. So it's almost like when you take your whole presence and you compress it down into this smaller space, that that that's the issue. And gratitude is opening yourself in the right way to actually being capable of harnessing that limitless energy that awareness is.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I think that's right. Because
I do want to get to faith there, though.
do you want to go ahead?
You can go first. I'll think about it.
Well, I was going to say this speaks toward the, you know, in this book, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason by D.C. Schindler, that the vision of the good that comes into view is so like it's maybe the one like the highest level notion. If agape is the deepest, it's the highest.
Mm.
The the thing that is a no thing that makes everything else real might be the right way to talk about goodness. It's like you can't say what goodness is because it's not like anything else. You can't compare anything else to it because it's just a different kind of thing. The only thing that the only way goodness can appear is by being in relation to it. And so in some in very deep ways, what Plato is doing through all of his work is, building it's like it has this feeling of like a vortex of of dramatic, it's drama, it's dialogue, it's ideas, it's philosophy and metaphysics and ethics and all these things, but it's all trying to just swirl around and just kind of point towards this idea of the good. That makes all of it what it is, and inherent in that, and well, inherent in and maybe at the bottom of that is the figure of Socrates. And the reason that there's this way in which the reason that works is because of the absolute humility of Socrates. Like he's so like Socrates doesn't like the thing that Socrates does is he goes wherever people are. Like when he talks to Thrasymachus in the beginning of the Republic, and he's just like this way in your face, like over the top violent in his trying to force his opinion onto other people. Like Socrates doesn't tell him he's wrong. He takes on his position. He just goes to it with him. He's just okay.
Let's look around.
Yeah. So let's look around. Like, okay, well, what are we working with here? What is this, right? And and then he just goes how far that person wants to go, right? Yeah. And if they jump off, then he goes on to somebody else who wants to talk, who wants to pick up there, right? And so I don't know that Plato goes to any real lengths to make. I don't know, because I've really not read Plato as a primary source that much. I have some, but not that much. But I don't know. I've not heard a lot about Socrates exemplifying gratitude a ton, although he probably does. I don't know. But he's also kind of a ruffian in some ways and kind of a jerk to some people. At least he comes across that way. So I don't know.
He's provocative for sure.
Exactly. So I don't know. I don't want to say something that is wrong there, but I think that humility in some sense, like humility and gratefulness can provide you that open space within yourself, because you're recognizing your own undeservedness and you're actually releasing yourself into agape in a sense, right? Or just allowing yourself to be placing yourself in relationship to agape such that you recognize it for what it is and not on any ground of what you are. And that is what actually that's what gives light to the good. So it's like, do you see what I'm trying to do there?
And it very much works that way if you imagine the different layers of your identity as kind of layers of that vortex, and you're trying to work your way up into the agape space and drop these layers, as we're talking about,
Mhm.
to get to the good.
One, thus you can become transparent to the good,
Yes.
because that's what it means
Yeah.
to really live in the agape space. Like the highest level you can get to in some, or I can get to, at least as far as I can tell, would be just to that my entire awareness coming into reality is nothing but agape. But if that were the case, it's not like the whole world collapses and the story's over at that point. If that were the case, because this is not a utopic vision, this is not that. If that were to be actualized as the case, then what might be possible would be that others might be able to get a glimpse of the good through the life and encounter with a person who was no person at all in some sense.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that a fascinating way to put it too? Where like ultimately we are the universe and trying to be the universe. You know what I mean? Like the greatest thing we could aspire to is to not get ourselves in the way of that project.
Yeah.
um,
The greatest
but
aspiration you
truly,
can have
yeah,
is
yeah.
to, well, and this is like, again, this is from this, this is Maximus the Confessor, this is Plato, this is all this stuff, is that, to be fully what you are, to acknowledge yourself as a fragment, but to love that fragment absolutely.
Mm.
To acknowledge yourself to be relative and not the absolute, but to, because of your relation to the absolute, allow yourself to be loved absolutely. Then the relative can become absolute. Not it, or it becomes relative absolutely, because the
Mm-hmm.
absolute can for the absolute to be truly absolute, it must be absolute and include the relative within it.
Yes.
The absolute does not destroy the relative. The absolute is absolute and makes the relative absolutely relative as it is.
Yeah, and so you might say like we are fragments in the whole, but we also are fragments within our own fragment. Like
Mhm.
we're not even whole ourselves. We have these identities, these issues, and I think that layering of that fragment and whole that's taking place within the cosmos as us and within us as our identities is a good way of looking at where the tensions come from. And I do think ultimately that faith is actually an exchange between the identities, which I believe the vertical space of transcendental functions operate through the identities, because the identity is a frame, and what you're seeing is taking place horizontally from that frame. But you have multiple identities that you can take on from the God level to humanity level, individual level, and you've got variants that you are with your parents or you are with your friends or
Sure.
whatever, um, and versions. All of these versions hide things from each other behind the scenes, kind of thing.
Mm.
But I think so playing on the horizontal space is playing within an identity, but on the vertical space, it's actually the relationship between all the identities, the
Mm.
relationship of the mechanism that controls who's in the seat of consciousness is the identities engaging with each other and choosing which one sits on the throne. And one of the identities is kind of the non-identity, right? The process of identification that we talk of as
Mm.
the ideal space. But um, it's
Mm.
kind of you have this kind of kingdom within you that is kind of warring for control of that consciousness. And when it's in the throne, like you're looking horizontally through its perspective. And so faith, I think, is cooperation between the identities that
Mm.
make us up.
And in some sense, is it almost, And it almost sounds like when you're talking about the identity that is, you know, that is no identity in a sense. The identity
You know,
that is,
the through line identity,
yeah,
identifying as a through line.
like in some sense, that's the essence of faith itself, maybe, because that's the release of frame,
Yes,
which is what faith is, at least in function.
the total release of frame.
Yeah. So it's as
Because
if,
all of our value, all of our structure is built within these frames, and the faith is that's not where value is. Put those frames away, and you'll find real value. Yeah.
it's amazing that for so long I thought the meaning of faith, not that I had this definition in mind, but the way I related to that word was something like the arbitrary assent to something that seems unreal. It's amazing the violence that we've done to some of these ideas
Yeah,
and to ourselves thereby.
to each other.
Yeah. No. Hmm. Well,
And that, I think that's honestly part of it. Like that kind of wraps it well, because we're in a position where we have done this damage to ourselves personally,
mhm,
and to each other, to the world. And it's only faith that gets you out of that. It's only faith in other humans. It's only faith in the ecopic space and process. It's only the willingness to take a step onto uncertain ground that leads you upwards. It, we are actually, I like to be geometrical about this when we can be, and we are literally talking about how to step onto the plane of another dimension within our minds. When we're talking about faith, we're
mhm,
talking about the hidden staircase
mhm,
that gets you to, that gets the space-time interface to operate beyond itself
mm,
as the process of its own being. And that's the space of total possibility, because all of those artificial constraints come from the frames.
mm.
All constraints come from frames, basically.
Yeah. 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 Well,
We got it.
yeah. uh, Now, as always, back to living living the dream
Mm-hmm.
gives a whole new meaning to that colloquial phrase we all use.
Mm-hmm. And that is usually caught up in the wrong type of imagination, right? It's like, imagine your life perfect, which most people just swap in a celebrity and be like, that's what I want. But that's not what you want, because you are different than that. That's frankly not even what they want, probably. But
Yeah.
it's realizing that we don't even have the criteria at hand to evaluate the situation for our own best interest on the level of the self, on the level of the frame that we create and occupy.
Mhm.
It does not have goodness, doesn't have the equations or the properties that could lead you to goodness. That is definitely where I need to look more,
Mm.
because um, there's some part of me that's come along for the journey, or even been part of the fuel for the journey for me, that has been like, you can find the good and you can label it and
Mm.
point to it, and
Yeah.
you can in certain ways, right? It's not like
Mm.
impossible totally. That's what we're doing, but
Yeah.
on the same level, it ultimately is, maybe what it is that something can point to goodness, but it's not you,
Yeah.
and just like driving that home point home all the way
Yeah.
to cleave judgment in half,
Yeah. 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 Because it's that there's the necessity of truly deeply acknowledging transcendence as such.
yeah
It's like It's like, say, you can't acknowledge that. At least I couldn't. I'm not going to put it on other people. I could not acknowledge that as long as this is just because Christianity was the tradition I grew up in. As long as I understood the deepest question in my life being about what happened after I died, you might say, which is how I understood Christianity to be relevant to me.
What happens to me? Yeah.
I didn't really acknowledge the transcendent.
Yeah.
This is actually, I think, the deep level and at which, and I would never say this to someone who deeply believed that, because it's kind of violent in some sense. But I think for me, what I found at the deepest level of that that reason for participating or believing in some kind of faith, that underneath that was this strange perversion in which I had become, it ultimately was up to me to make an infinite decision.
Yeah.
And if it's up to me to make an infinite decision, then in some fundamental way, I, in fact, am God. And that's not the place you're trying to go.
Yeah.
So, but it goes deeper than just, say, the Christian heaven and hell. I think it's like one of the things, and there were some notes of this earlier in the conversation. I can't pick them up exactly right now, but approaching the question of what happens after we die and using that as kind of the theoretical vigor, right? Why do we build a model, right? Why are we building a system of understanding how the world works? Why? Is it to build utopia? Is it to make the world a better place? If it is, then you're not really acknowledging transcendence, because to really acknowledge transcendence requires that everything be open. Doesn't mean you can't build, doesn't mean you can't build models, right?
You can't need to. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can't postulate the goal. That's maybe the biggest thing, right? Maybe that's the problem with the Tower of Babel, because really I'm talking about Tower of Babel versus Mount Sophia here. Mount Sophia is always open. It's always beyond you. It might be the most elegant, beautiful system, far beyond anything we've ever imagined so far, and it's still not the whole thing. Because, it's the symbol versus the idol, and the Tower of Babel thinks it knows where it's going. It thinks heaven's up there in some way, right?
Yeah. It's like I just have to refine my sketch, and that'll get us to heaven. I've almost got all the details just right.
Yeah. All right, my friend. I think my wife is going to be back here shortly, probably. So.
Alrighty, sounds good.
Next time I see you, I will probably be a father. So.
Oh, wow, that's exciting.
Hey. That's it'll be interesting.
You've got a lot of life stuff kicking up for you around this time too, so navigate that well, because you only get, this is a very limited window of having a newborn. Let's put it that way. You'll be amazed how fast they grow.
Yeah.
So enjoy it.
Thank you. I'll do my best. I'm trying to glean what existential nuggets there are along the way. So
awesome. Good luck to you, Ken.
See you later, my friend.
Again.
Yep.
See ya.